Hey everybody, my name's Daryl Obert. Thanks for watching my video 45 tips in 45 minutes. So the tips in this are being pulled from the blog posts I've been doing the last year on the area. We're going to be looking at tips that cover off basic things, dynamics, rigging, and finishing with rendering. So thanks again for taking the time to check this out. I hope you guys enjoy it. All right, so let's dive right in here and go over things that I would classify as the basics. The first thing that we're going to talk about is some things that you may need to do to get your scene looking appropriate inside of the viewport in Maya. So you'll notice as I zoom in and out of this scene, I'm getting some really strange popping happening, and that's Z-buffering problems that are occurring because my scale of my scene is very large, and my camera's near and far clipping planes haven't been adjusted properly to deal with it. This is really easy to fix inside of Maya. All you have to do is select the camera, go to the attributes for that camera, and just adjust the near clip plane value or the far clip plane value to a range that's appropriate so that you no longer get that Z buffering information kind of popping back and forth like that. So the next thing that I want to talk to you about really quickly inside of Maya is the way that the framing happens when you start to change things like the aspect ratio of your viewer. So you'll notice that as I hit my Control A key here and toggle between my channel box and my attribute editor, obviously my viewport changes its aspect ratio, and it really changes the overall feel of the framing of my shot as I do this. And I personally don't like the default behavior that Maya ships out the door with. So what I do is I switch my camera to have its camera settings, instead of doing a fill operation, to go to vertical. So by switching it to vertical, as I change the aspect ratio here, you can see that my scene basically stays tied vertically to the same size. And I personally find that to be much nicer, especially when you do something like maybe turn on the resolution gate. So we'll go ahead and we'll turn on that resolution gate. Again, one of the things that I often will do when I turn that resolution gate on is go in here and adjust the overall display of that. Instead of being overscanned by a value of 1.3, I'll put it to like 1.05 just to have a thin little border on there. And I will often also turn off that gate mask, which is right here. So with that done, now as I jump back and forth between these guys, you can see that that vertical spacing stays exactly the same, and I find it to be a little bit more elegant to work this way. So another thing that's kind of cool inside of Maya is when you jump to your right view, and you'll notice this a lot if you're working with very large scenes, you start to zoom out, you might not see everything in your scene. Like you'll notice that I'm only seeing a little section of that car. And the reason that happens is these views that you have, your top, your front, your sides, these actually are simply just cameras inside of Maya that exist in world space. So if I go ahead and I slide this camera out, a little bit further here and then jump over to my right view, you can see I'm now seeing the car. So you can use this to set up a sliver of the scene that you see. Like if you have a giant scene that's like a city or something like that and you only want to see one block, you can position that camera where you want to be. Like maybe I don't want to see the car, I only want to see the girl. And you can use that in conjunction with those clipping planes to really dial in, the range of values that you're going to see. So it's a really, it's a pretty cool little trick. So the next thing that I want to talk about really quickly is the direct manipulator tool, and I use this all the time inside of Maya. If we go ahead and we grab something like a spotlight and I enter into the direct manipulator tool by hitting the T key on my keyboard, you'll notice that I now have a series of controls that I can use to adjust this light. I can change the look at point as well as the back or the body of the light. I can also use this little this little like clock looking thing to start cycling through different options for the cone angle or the penumbra. So lots of different options will show up with a direct manipulator on things like light or forces or the extrude tool. You can always go back into those tools by hitting the T key and bring up those on-screen menus that allow you to interact with them. Another thing that the direct manipulator tool does that's really pretty cool is it allows you to work with rigs that you've defined custom handles for. So in this example, I've got some custom handles on the skeleton's spine that I know I'm always going to want to rotate, and I know when I grab this hand, I'm always going to want to go to my translate tool. So instead of having to hit, the hotkey for move or rotate, I can set up the default manipulator and on each of those nodes, and then use that direct manipulator tool to switch between those default manipulators. So if you go back to the control handle for that left hand, go into the display tab, set that to translate. We'll grab maybe this spine joint handle, set that guy to be rotate. So now if I hit back into my T tool, you can see that it's automatically, when I select that node, set to give me the rotate manipulator, right? If I go back and select the hand here, it's automatically switched to the translate tool. So we go back to this guy, it's the rotate tool. So you don't have to sit there and switch hotkeys back and forth. once you've defined the default manipulator and you go into the direct manipulation tool. So I think that's pretty cool. Another pretty fun windowing thing that I do all the time, especially if I'm doing like modeling, is use the control spacebar to clear out my windows. The control spacebar will bring everything back. So control spacebar is just a quick hotkey to blow away all the different windows or all the different toolbars and time sliders and things like that inside of Maya. So often when I'm working, I want to have multiple versions of Maya up and I want to get data back and forth between them. And instead of doing like a file save, file import, I use the copy paste a fair bit. So let's go ahead and just jump over to this guy. Let's close that guy down here. So what the copy paste allows me to do is it allows me to not have to do a file save. It just lets you work a little bit faster. So you can say edit copy. All this is really doing is saving a temp file. So we did that. We'll jump back over to this version of Maya and we can just do a simple edit paste. Now this is going to paste in here and you'll notice that when it did that pasting operation, it added in kind of a prefix to all of those nodes, which is kind of gnarly. I don't dig that at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to clear that up really quickly using the modify search and replace name. So I've already got pasted underscore underscore in there. And if I hit apply on all, so this is going to scrub through the whole scene, it errors out. It doesn't know what to do. So here's a really cool little trick. If you just hit the period key and you hit apply, it'll actually operate and do the right thing. And I'm pretty sure it's not documented anywhere. I have no idea how I figured it out, but I'm really happy that it works because I use it all the time. So with that done, the next thing that we want to do is we want to get these wheels positioned onto that vehicle. And obviously when that was modeled, it was done at the origin. And when I was doing the layout of this scene, I kind of offset the car there and these guys aren't lining up. So this is really simple to do inside of Maya. There's lots of different align tools inside of Maya. I use the parent command a lot to do simple alignments. So what I'll do is I'll grab an object and then I'll grab the object that I wanted to get, I wanted to assume these translations and rotation values. I'll parent it underneath that hierarchy, but I'm going to tell it to make sure that preserve position is turned off. By default, preserve position is turned on. If you turn that guy off and hit apply, well, boom, just like that, those wheels now, inherited basically its parent's translation and rotation values. So now we've got our new set of wheels on here, and a lot of times when I'm doing iterations, I want to be able to toggle back and forth between, version A, version B. And I'll make a little shelf button to do that for myself. And this is really simple to do inside of Maya, right? So if we go ahead and just slide that guy up there, we'll bring up our Mel window here. All right, so let's just clear that out here. We'll turn on Echo All Commands, which is this little guy right here. And if I turn off one of these shelf buttons, oops, looks like I turned it off. It was already on. Let's turn that guy back on. So Echo All Commands you can get to with the little icon right there, or you can use the history to turn it on. So basically what we've got here is we've got these little shelf buttons, and we turn Echo All Commands on. It basically goes through and it does the opposite of that. So then we'll turn this one on. So now what I've got is if I grab these two little lines of code here and put those up on my shelf as a Mel button, I've got a button that lets me really quickly jump between A and B and get that really snap, that pop that happens where I'm not going, all right, let me see what this one looks like. Because I find like when they disappear and then they come back on, I'm not really getting that sense of, A versus B. So I use these little shelf buttons to do that all the time. Another thing that's really kind of cool about the shelf buttons in Maya is you can string together, it's just Mel, right? So you can string together a bunch of commands here, and anything you can query, you can drag and drop in those shelves. So something like, often I want to have a clean view of my scene, which I'm calling fast on my shelf here. So if I click the fast button, it clears everything out. All it really did was it went through and did a show none, and then it did turn polygons on. So if we look at this button, you'll see that it basically did all objects 0 for this model panel, which is my perspective view, and then it went the second line, it turned the poly meshes on. But notice that you can have a double click command. So this is going through and it's doing all models 1, which is essentially saying show all, right? It's doing that. That's what the button does. So the first time I click the button, it does the name of it. Double click it, it does the opposite of the name. It brings all my stuff back on that I might need to interact with. So I've got like a clean view for whatever reason, and then I've got like my full view that turns everything back on. And I use these kind of double click functions a fair bit inside of Maya. So the next thing that we want to talk about is as I'm moving around here, in my scene, I can use the bracket keys to go in between my different views. So it's sort of an undo cue for Maya. And you'll notice that as I'm doing that, these animated cameras are happening. When you're first learning Maya, the animated cameras are cool, but after you get the hang of 3D, seeing those animated transitions, to me, that's just a half a second wasted. So I always modify that. I go to my preferences, and there's a few things that I always change. Number one, I go to my undo cue and I set that up to something a little bit higher than 50 because I make more mistakes in 50 always. And then I go to File Projects, and in File Projects, I will turn on Ignore File Version if it's not on. This allows, say, maybe Maya 2013 to open a Maya 2015 file. It lets you roll back. Often you still need to save it as an ASCII file, but once you've done that and you have Ignore File Version turned on, you don't have to go in there and hack the ASCII file and delete the header or anything like that. It does it all for you automatically, and it lets you kind of roll back into Maya. Obviously, it'll error and say, there were errors found when you opened it, but almost everything that you want is going to be in there, and it lets you kind of back out of a newer version into an older version if need be. So back onto the cameras, I take this guy and I just turn these guys off. I find it to be a lot nicer. Now if I just do these guys, it's just instant boom, 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 boom. It just makes Maya feel a bit snappier than it did before. So the next thing that we want to talk about is getting bonus tools. Make sure you go to the Help menu and you go to the resources and you download bonus tools. There are a ton of really useful tools inside of here, and some of the new ones like this replicate objects on components, it's actually pretty cool, pretty fun. Like if you're doing any MoGraph type stuff, this one's actually pretty cool. Let's just go ahead and increase the size of this sphere, and just to show what that replicate objects does, I'll get like a little polygon cube or something, really simple stuff, right? We'll grab these verts up here, and then we'll add to our selection that object that we want to replicate, and we'll just say bonus tools, modify, replicate objects on components. We'll do instances. We'll have it aligned to them. It goes through, it does that. We can hide that guy. We don't need to see that anymore. And because these are instances, right, if I grab these verts now and translate those at a vert level, you can get these really kind of fast, easy, trippy sort of, little MoGraphy things happening. So kind of fun, kind of cool. Play around with it. You might find it useful if you're doing that type of work. And that's just a bonus tool, right? So kind of a freebie. Another one that I use all the time in the bonus tools is the make dynamic animation, secondary animation. So you just grab a beginning of an IK or beginning of a joint chain, end of a joint chain, jump into bonus tools again one more time. Come down here to dynamics, make joints dynamics. We'll use an in-hair system to do that. We'll go ahead and we'll apply that. And now if we increase our range slider, and we'll use the ever useful dynamic interactive playback. We'll talk about this a bit more. Interactive playback, super useful if you're doing anything with dynamics. Lets you kind of play around with them a little bit here. So the last thing that I want to mention in the basics is make sure when you save your scenes, you hit the 5 key. Turn off the textures, turn off the lighting, hit 5, hit File, Save. That way when you open Maya, it doesn't have to load up, do a viewport 2.0 calculating, anything like that. It's going to open the file very, very quick, and you can work with it in non-lit mode, non-textured mode. And if you're working with other people, they're going to be really happy that you didn't make them wait for loading up, the startup of Maya and viewport 2.0 and all the textures and things like that. It's very, very quick to load a file if it's been hit in 5. Hit 5 before you do a file save. So that's pretty much it for the basic stuff. Let's jump into the next section. All right, so we're going to be talking about dynamics in the next section. And the first thing when working with any of the physics engine inside of Maya is to make sure that your playback speed is set to play every frame free or play every frame free max real time. This is essential for the physics engines to work correctly. So we're going to be looking at end particles and how we can use turbulence to get these guys to move around and do some interesting effects. So to get some particles in my scene, I'm going to be using the end particle tool. So the end particle tool allows you to drop down individual particles, sketch some particles out maybe, or in this example, we're going to be using a grid that's just got some numerical values set. So you just click on the screen once, hit the return key to complete the tool, and you can see that we're now presented with a group of particles in our environment. And because these are end particles, they're going to be affected by that nucleus node automatically. So as soon as we start to play this back, you can see they basically start to drop to the ground and then hit the ground and collide with it. So what I want to do is I want to dial in the look of these guys a little bit, and I'm going to be using a preset to do this. I recommend using presets. I use them all the time for shader work and for dynamics work. So really what they do is they just take a snapshot of all the parameters in the current node that's loaded up in your attribute editor. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this with speed 2, and what that does is it basically turns them into streak particles, and it gives them a little bit of gradient based on their speed. So if we play it back, you can see as they accelerate and drop down, they start to wipe through that gradient. Now we want to have these guys get swirled around by a turbulence field. So I'm going to go in here and turn off the effect of gravity in the environment, and I'm going to add to that a turbulence field. Now, you'll notice in my outliner, I've already got this turbulence field in my scene. So to make that relationship, all we have to do is go to our dynamic relationships window and join in the turbulence field. So as soon as we do that, we can minimize this guy down now, and we play this back, what happens is those particles get caught up in that turbulence, and essentially they get blown away, and you're not really seeing any swirls or vortexes or eddies. You're just seeing sort of a scattering of those particles. So what we want to do is we want to subtract some of the energy from the simulation so that that dynamic system, that turbulence field, can really grab a hold of those particles and kind of move them around and catch them. So there's a couple ways of doing that. You could use damp and drag and things like that, but I actually like to use the conserve value. By dropping that conserve value down now, you can really start to see those particles getting caught up inside of that dynamic system, which I think is exactly what I wanted, and it looks kind of cool. So if we go back and we turn the gravity on here, you're going to see that we're going to get this sort of nice fall of those particles, and it kind of gets caught up in that turbulence field, and you really get this kind of really cool looking effect because of us dropping down that conserve value. Now I've got another field in my environment that I'm going to begin using to interact with these particles, and that's this Newton field. So if we grab these particles and bring that dynamic relationships window back up one more time and highlight on that Newton field, and we begin to play this back, you'll notice that the Newton field, it's grabbing a few of those guys and it's just blowing them away or spitting them out into space. And the reason it's not grabbing everything is because in the Newton field, if we go ahead and look at its attributes, you'll notice that oops, grab the wrong node there. You'll notice that its attenuation is set to a high value. Now if I use that direct manipulator tool that we used before, which again is the T key in the first part of the presentation, you can again get a good sense of what's actually going on in the actual viewport. So if I increase that attenuation a good bit, and now we play it back here, you'll see that that Newton field really starts to grab a hold of those guys and do what you'd expect. It starts to pull them into itself here, which is kind of cool. Now one thing that I want to do is I want to be able to move this Newton field around and sort of interactively play with it, and I'm going to use that interactive playback to do that, which is something that I always do. So to add a button to your shelf, just Control Shift left click on it. It adds that interactive playback button onto my shelf. So with that done, we can rewind our particles here, hit the interactive playback, and as they start to move around, I can use my middle mouse button and not actually have to touch the Newton field to start to move it around here. And you can really get a sense of what happens as I interactively play with these particles, which is kind of cool. Now if I wanted to go into those particles and modify them as they were playing back, notice that the attribute editor, even though I've selected the particle and it's highlighted, hasn't changed. So if you hit the Control A key 2 times and kind of refresh that window, it allows you to basically jump back and forth and adjust these attributes or these values. So if I wanted to get back to that Newton field, again, all I have to do is hit the Control A key 2 times, and I could do something like reverse the magnitude on that guy. We'll rewind that. So again, that Control A key is actually a pretty fun tool. Again, if I wanted to get back to that end particle system, Control A 2 times real quick will allow me to get back into that end particle system. So another thing that I'll do a lot of times if I know I'm going to be working with a given file for many, many days is I'll actually make shelf buttons that allow me to pop the focus. So the focus tool allows you to change what node is being displayed in the attribute editor. So if you go into your Mel window and you have Echo All Commands turned on, we'll just turn that on real quick. We'll clear our history, and you run that focus command once for the Newton field, and you go to the very top of the list here. You can see there's that Mel command for getting that Newton field loaded up in the attribute editor. So we'll drag that up to a shelf, and we'll clear the history out here one more time, and I'll pop the focus onto that end particle shape. So we can kind of scroll up here and double click on this line, which is the command to load the end particle shape or pop the focus on the end particle shape. We'll turn off that Echo All Commands real fast. So now if we jump back into the interactive playback while these guys are going, I've now got shelf buttons that allow me to quickly toggle between these guys. So it's a really, it's pretty useful. I use that all the time if I know I'm going to be working on a scene a lot here. So let's just play with these guys a little bit more. All right, so that's it for the end particles. Let's go ahead and talk about particle flow. So this is something that's kind of cool that you can do inside of Maya. You can take a curve, and you can just use the sketch curve tool. I like the sketch curve tool. I kind of sketch out a little curve on that guy. With that done, I can go ahead and jump over to my Dynamics shelf or switch to my Dynamics menu, depending on how you want to get to it. And you can do an effect, which is curve, create curve flow. And you could also do it just simply with this button right here, which is the create curve flow button. So as soon as you do that, we're now going to be presented with some particles, and they're a little hard to see. So let's just go ahead and jump into those particles and change their draw type from what they are to something like spheres. They'll be little dark balls, but they'll show up a little bit easier, and we can make that something like 0.25, make them a little smaller. So what we've got now is we've got this particles flowing down that curve, which is pretty awesome. And one of the things that's kind of cool about this is you can take these and adjust, the overall shape, where these lines exist, how big they get, what's going on with these particles as they shoot down that curve. And because it's a curve, you could animate the curve, or you could change the shape of the curve. This is a pretty fun thing. If you have a curve that's highlighted and you control right mouse click on top of that guy, you can quickly switch to the first CV or the last CV. So if I grab that last CV and I hit my L key while that last CV is selected, you can see that I can turn on and off lock length on a curve. So by having the L key, I'm holding it down and I'm clicking with my middle mouse button and just sort of dragging around here, I can start to reposition that curve, and the length is locked. It won't overextend itself. So it lets you adjust the overall shape of that curve in a kind of fun way. So here comes our particles, kind of shooting down here. So another thing that we can do is we can mix particles with fluids. So let's go ahead and see a couple of examples of that. I'm going to go ahead and create a new fluid shape, just a simple 3D container inside of here, and we'll position that guy up a little bit higher. So there's nothing that's adding density to this fluid container currently. So what I want to do is I want to grab my particle system and shift add to my selection this fluid shape here. So we've got our particles and our fluid shape both selected, and I'm just going to say fluids, edit contents, emit from object. Make sure that we switch this over to be an Omni. So we'll apply and close that guy. So now what we've got is we've got some particles that come in, and when they interact with that fluid shape, that fluid node, when they get inside of that fluid node, they start to add density to it. So to make this look a little bit better, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into my fluid node, and I'm going to say, you know what? Let's resize you and have you automatically resize. So now if we play this back, you can see here comes our fluid shape. There's our particles adding in that, that fluid to those guys. And I'm just going to use another preset to dial this in. And like I said, I really dig presets. So let's go ahead and play this back one more time with a slightly denser effect to that guy. So here comes our fluid shape. I don't really need to see the overall effect of the bottom of that guy. So if we go to our display for this, we're going to go ahead and we're going to just hide the draw of the bounding box on that guy around it. So we just get the fluids kind of coming in here. So speed this up here. We'll just crank this down to something like 30. Even 20 will be fine for this example. So I just dropped the resolution of that fluid node to kind of get a little bit more speed out of it. But you can see the overall effect of those particles adding in that density. I think that's pretty fun, pretty cool looking. So another thing that you can do that's kind of cool is you can have these you can have particles not only add density to fluids nodes, but you can have fluids node act as a field that moves particles. So let's look at an example of that. Let's go ahead and grab those particles right there, and I'm going to say, you know what? From those particles, I want to emit some in particles. So we'll say in particles, emit from object. I'm going to tell it to be Omni in this example. That's great. We'll go ahead and we'll create that. So we now have a new in particle set in our scene, and you can see those particles getting emitted from those other particles and dropping down, which is kind of cool. I'm going to dial these guys in with again just using a preset. We use this DTO preset that's got that kind of speed ramp in there. So as they accelerate, they're going to kind of swipe through some colors here. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back into that dynamic relationships window for those in particles. And we're going to add those in, have the fluid shape become something that can interact with those guys. So as soon as we do that, well, the particles go flying off. So like that first example where we use that conserve to get those guys to get controlled by that turbulence field, we're going to do the same thing for the dynamic properties on this new end particle. We're going to jump in here and we're going to say, you know what, conserve will zero that guy out. So now those particles are really going to just get caught up in the field, and as they're playing back and swiping through that, we can jump down here into the shading here and maybe adjust this a little bit more. So we can drop that opacity down a little bit on those guys, and maybe just go in here and make it a little more sensitive to that ramp so that they sort of go through a little bit more of the gradient there. So as those guys kind of move through that, you can really see them getting caught up in that effect of that fluid system, which I think is just a kind of fun example, kind of a cool thing that you can do with these particles and these fluids. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about really quickly is Xgen. So what we want to do is we want to use Xgen to instance this piece of geometry across this weird alien terrain, and I want to make sure that the background objects have a low polygon count and the foreground objects have a high polygon count. Xgen has the ability to export out an LOD when you're doing this. So the way the LOD works is it uses the poly reduction tool. So before you go ahead and you export this object out as an archive, you need to first make sure that the poly reduce tool works on it. If for some reason the poly reduce tool errors, all you have to do is go ahead and use the poly cleanup, and more likely than not it's going to be non-manifold geometry that you want to clean up to make sure that that poly reduction tool works. So with that done, and you've kind of pre-flooded it and made sure the poly reduction tool works, you need to make sure that your object's at the origin. And my object here isn't at the origin, so I need to zero that guy out and make sure that it's down there on that grid before I go ahead and I export that out, or else I'd have a weird offset in it when I instance it across the piece of geometry. So with that done, you jump into your Xgen window. You'll say export selection as archives. We're going to tell it to automatically reduce. We'll say 90% for the low res guys and 50% for the higher res guys, and you'll give it a name like DTO LOD, and you hit the return key and you think you just did it. Actually, all you've done when you hit the return key is close the window. So make sure you actually click the export button. So I've already done that. I don't need to do it again. We're going to go ahead and just load in that archive object onto this low-res polygon piece of geometry using Xgen. So we'll go ahead and we'll create a description that's going to be geometry, random, and using expression. So we'll hit create on that guy. It goes through. As soon as you see those little squares, you know your bindings happened. Before I add the archive down here into my description, what I want to do is set that density down to a very low value, because I don't want to flood this with billions of those guys and choke my scene. So it's always a good idea to drop that value down before you load any archives in. So if we jump into our documents and go to the Xgen folder inside of here and grab the archives and grab this one right here, it's going to come in and it's going to say, do you want to bring in the shaders? Yes, of course I do. And check it out. There's no shaders on there. So that's kind of weird. To fix that, all you have to do is go to the primitive attributes and give that frame number a kick, put it up to a value of 1, and now you can see that it's loaded it. And it's using the LODs to do this. So as I start to scrub through these values here, you can see that there's the low-res guys. So we want those low-res guys to kick in a little further back. Maybe kick those low-res guys in around a value of 75. And then I want those medium-res guys to also kick in a little further back. So I want to get my high-res guys in the foreground up here. So you can see as I push these bounds of where the mid-distance and the low distance start to kick in, the geometry actually changing out. So that's pretty much it for the Xgen stuff. The next thing that we're going to talk about really quickly is Bifrost. So next I want to talk to you really quickly about Bifrost. I use Bifrost with Alembic a lot. So every time I create a Bifrost sim, I always save it out as an Alembic cached file. And that's what we got right here, is the Alembic cache of the ocean that's being brought in. And the reason that it shows up with this rainbow pattern on it is by default, the import's going to be showing the color per vertex information representing velocity and vorticity. So if you don't want that in your viewport, all you have to do is go to the shape node, go to the mesh component display, and turn off display colors. And as soon as you do that, now your ocean's going to look like whatever shader you have assigned to it. So one of the things that's kind of cool about the Alembic caches inside of Maya is we have a special version of Alembic that's called a GPU cache that allows for very fast playback. It allows you to basically bypass Maya as a dependency graph and have the the Alembic file dumped directly onto the GPU. So it's very, very fast, but it needs to fit into the RAM footprint of your GPU. So what I will often do is I'll select the Alembic cache that's the standard Alembic cache and create a GPU version of it by simply going to Pipeline Cache, GPU, Export Selection. And what I like to do is I like to save it out on every 2 evaluations, or evaluate every 2 frames. So if you put it to evaluate every 2 frames, I'm basically going to be getting this at, not 30 frames per second, it'll be at 15 frames per second, but for a preview purpose, it will be fine. And I'll basically just set my start and end range to 50 and 125, and you go ahead and you export this guy out, and it's going to save out a file, and I always turn off the use smoothing and just say use base tessellation on that guy. It's going to give me a file that's basically going to be very, very fast to play back. So then if you bring that cache in as a GPU cache, again, it's a special version of the file. It's kind of formatted a little bit different, and when you import it as a GPU cache, it's going to play back very, very quickly. So we'll jump over to our iDrive and we'll grab 150 on that guy. We'll import that in. And you can see as it starts to load in, it gives me a little wireframe, and it's going to cache that information in. And once it's in, if we do 50 to 150, and we play it back one time, the first time through, it's going to load, and you can see how fast it's playing that guy back. The original sim was a 16 gig Alembic file, and obviously look at the speed that you get from that. So for a preview purpose, this is a really, really cool thing. Next up, we're going to go over some tips and tricks with rigging and characters. So the first thing that we're going to be looking at is how we can use some of these snapping options to help us lay down bones in a fast, easy way. I want to get some finger bones going down my character's hand here. So to do that, what I'm going to do is turn on the Project to Snap at Center tool and just go ahead and enter it into my Joint tool. So with the Joint tool and that Project to Snap Center turned on, I can very quickly start to lay down the joints exactly where I want them. And I'm just using the G key, which is the hotkey to repeat your last tool, to jump back into that tool really quickly. In a matter of a few seconds here, you can see that we're going to have our hand completed. So once we get all of the joints laid down, all we have to do is grab them all and add them back into our skeleton hierarchy by hitting the P key or the parenting key. So in a matter of a few seconds there, we are able to add in those hand joints. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to add a little bit of control on my character's eyebrow with some joints that kind of follow that surface. So again, using these different snapping options, I can do that very efficiently and easily inside of Maya. First, we'll turn off the Project to Center snapping, and I'm going to go ahead and select the piece of geometry that I want those joints to follow and make it a live surface. So when that surface has been made live, now if I go back into my Joint tool, I can really quickly just start kind of tracing the profile of where I want to have that control and hit the Enter key to complete that function. So we'll join this back into our skeleton's hierarchy one more time. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to teach the skin cluster that already exists about these newly added joints, because right now they won't have any influence on them. Also, make sure you turn off that live surface, because if you leave that on there, that can mess you up. It's always a good idea to make sure you turn that guy off. So what we want to do is we want to add these joints back into this skin cluster as an influence, and I'm going to change a few of the default options. If we go into Add Influence and bring up the option box for this, I always turn on lock weights, and we can use geometry off because it's just joints in this example. The reason I turn on lock weights is I don't want Maya reweighting something that I might have already spent a long time getting just the way I like, just to add in a little bit extra influence in a given area. So by turning on lock weights, these joints are going to get added in as an influencer to that skin cluster, but by default they won't have any values weighted to them. So we have to manually go in and start adding those back in with the paint tools. And I think this is a much easier, less destructive way of doing it. So we'll go ahead and we'll say apply to that guy. And with that done, we can jump back into our paint weights tool. And with our paint weights tool here, we can go ahead and say select influence, just make sure we're on that guy, and I can just start adding in a little bit of weighting in that area. Now if I want to test this out, if I just click my middle mouse button, Maya jumps me back out to the rotate tool for the current object that I have selected, and if I want to get back into my paint weights tool, all I have to do is click with my left mouse button one more time, maybe add a little more weight over here. So again, the middle mouse button will let me jump into this sort of testing mode. Clicking with the left mouse button puts me back into my brush-based tools. So with that done, let's go ahead and talk about another thing that I do all the time. So we've got this character's tail here, and if I go ahead and I rotate this guy around, you'll notice that it really starts to lose a lot of that volume, or it's not really preserving the volume as we start to spin that around. So to get around that, we're going to change the default option on this skin cluster from classic linear to have some DQ skinning in there. So as soon as we do that, you can see that volume's been preserved. So I always use the dual quaternion or the weighted map. What the weighted map does is it allows you to paint a luminosity map that adjusts how much linear versus dual quaternion skinning you're going to get. So I always use either the DQ skinning or the weighted blend to get my characters to preserve the volume in the areas where I want them to preserve that volume. It's a pretty good thing to do. So the next thing that I want to talk to you really quickly about is working with lattices and some of the things that you can do when you are working with lattices. So let's go ahead and grab this piece of geometry and we'll duplicate it, and I'm just going to go ahead and slide it over here. We'll just do an unlock on this guy and kind of push it over here. So let's say you're working on this character and the art director comes in and he's like, yeah, he looks cool and all, but I want his chin to be more pronounced or something like that. So that's something that you think, all right, I'll do that with a lattice. So let me grab some vertices on my dude's head here, and with those vertices selected, we'll go ahead and we'll create a lattice on it, and we'll just grab these lattice points really quickly. Oops. We'll grab something like that, and we'll just pull them down and kind of puff those guys up, right? So we've got that looking good, which is awesome. And then the director comes in and he's like, that's great, but I want the guy to be, a lot bigger too. So you think, all right, cool, I'll just scale him up. But as soon as you scale him up, he passes through that lattice. So really what we want to do is we want that lattice to go along for the ride of that scaling operation. So how do you go about doing something like that? Well, the easiest way I think to do it is to grab the lattice and make sure you get the base shape. That's very important because that allows it to move as a unit and not be disruptive in its nature. And then grab the piece of geometry and just group those guys together, maybe hold down the D key to slide that pivot point over. So once you've done something like that, now you can scale it all together as a unit and still have the flexibility of going back and adjusting those lattice points at any given time. So let's go ahead and just undo that a little bit. And let's say we wanted to get this guy back onto our rigged up, we want to get these tweaks or modifications back onto the guy that's rigged. Well, this is actually really easy to do. We'll just go ahead and we'll delete the history on this guy, and we'll grab this guy, and then we'll grab this guy, and we're going to do the substitute geometry command, which a lot of people don't use, but it's actually really pretty fast and pretty easy to work with. So by doing that, we've now gone ahead and substituted that geometry. We have those tweaks made with that chin, and all that skinning work that we've done previously is still going to be preserved, right? Because all we really did is just swap one piece of geometry out for the other piece of geometry, and all the weighting information will be preserved. So the last thing that I want to talk to you guys about is some ways to improve the speed in your rigs or get faster playback. And one of the best ways of doing that is by getting away from using expressions. Expressions are great, but they can be slow to evaluate. So a lot of things that you do with expressions, you can kind of mimic the same exact behavior using utility nodes inside of Maya. So let's go ahead and look at an example of that. We're going to go and create a little simple expression that's going to take his feet and find the middle of them and use that to drive the waist. So his waist always stays centered over his feet. So this is, again, a really simple thing to do with an expression or using these math nodes. So if we grab these guys right here and select both of them and hit the 3 key to show all of their inputs, and we grab something like what we're going to do is we're going to add the 2 feet together and then divide it by 2 to find the center of them. So we'll get a plus minus average node, and then we'll also get the multiply divide node. So kind of just lay these guys out like this. So we're going to grab the translate out and just put that into our plus minus average node as input 1, and then we'll do our input 0, and then we'll do this as input 1. And this is set to add together, so it's taking those two guys and adding them together. And then we want to do the output of this. So we're going to do an output of that XYZ, the 3D, and put that to input 1. And we're going to not do a multiply, but we're going to do a divide. So we're going to divide our X and our Z, and we're going to make our Y have a little bit more, something like 5. So it's going to find basically the center in our front view and then have the up and down be a little bit less because we divided it by a value of 5. So all we have to do is drag and drop that multiply divide onto our translate tool, or our translate for our character's hips, and now I built a simple little rig, and this is a very basic example, but if you had a very complex rig, by getting away from expressions and using these utility nodes, which are actually compiled math, it's going to be much, much faster. So let's jump into the next section and check out something else. Okay, so we're going to finish up with some tips and tricks for rendering, and the first thing that I want to talk about is the ability to bring in lots of texture maps very, very quickly into Maya. So the first thing we're going to do is bring up our Hypershade window, and then all I have to do is jump out to a Windows browser, a file-based browser, or a Mac or a Linux browser, and simply drag and drop the images that I want to work with directly into the Hypergraph window or the Hypershade window. And as soon as we do that, you can see we now have the ability to start texture mapping our ship very, very quickly, because I don't have to keep going in and say file browse and going out to the disk to get to these guys. I can just simply drag and drop them on directly from disk into Maya, and then directly from Maya onto the shader. So it's much faster than going through the file browser. So the next thing that I want to talk to you about is the icons. You'll notice that the icons didn't load. None of these swatches have loaded up. And the reason that happens is because of a preference that's set inside of Maya. There's a display preference for the max res for swatches. So what that means is any image under 2K will generate a swatch automatically in Maya. Anything over 2K won't. And we're doing that for performance. If you had tons of 8K images inside of here, it might take 5 or 10 minutes for Maya to generate all those swatches, so we don't want to bog you down with that. Keep in mind that at any time, if you want to override this, you can just simply right mouse click on top of a swatch and say refresh swatch, and Maya will basically make the swatch regardless of what you have set in your performance preference. Also keep in mind that that drag and drop that I showed for images into the Hypershade window, you can also drag and drop geometry directly into the viewport to import it into Maya. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the ability to parse down the information that your graphics card has to deal with in Viewport 2.0. Let's say, for example, you're working with a file at work on a Quadro K6000, and it's this massive scene, and it's got 8 gigs of texture memory that needs to be loaded up, and there's all these 4K images in there. And you want to bring it home to work on your laptop, and when you open up Maya, it just falls apart and it looks like all crazy in your viewport. Well, that's happening because you've run out of texture memory. So at any time, if you're trying to take images from a file that's maybe got massive texture images from a big workstation onto a smaller computer, you can basically go in here and clamp those textures down to something like 1024 or 512, and then it'll load up on a smaller machine and work just fine. So keep that in mind if you're trying to work with two different types of video cards, or a big machine and a little machine. So the next thing that I want to talk to you about is color management. So the color management in the extension release of Maya 2015 is pretty amazing, right? So I'm sure you guys have all seen the videos that I put together for that. There's a couple of things that I didn't cover in the videos that I want to talk about. And one of them is making sure that the color management is turned on by default whenever you create a new scene. And again, this is something that you set up in your preferences. So if we go to color management and we turn it on for this file, it's going to be a pretty standard color management scenario here. So we're working in a linear color space with Rec 709 primaries. My view transform, so the lookup or the kind of tone mapping that we're doing in both my render view as well as the color pots and the Viewport 2.0 is set to sRGB, and this is my default settings that I want to have every time I start Maya. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's export out my color management profile as this XML file, save that guy off. So now every time I do this, Maya is basically going to launch with the color management turned on, configured the way that I just saved that XML file out. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is the managed color pots inside of the swatches, and this is something that's kind of cool inside of Maya. So right now what we've got is we've got a default gray value of 0.5. Obviously 0.5 value is going to render out much brighter, and that's accurately represented in that color swatch. But look at what happens to that medium gray if I change my tone mapping to flame sepia. It obviously gets really warm from that lookup that we're doing, that view transform that we're doing, but the color swatch isn't changed, right? It still just looks like that standard kind of bright gray. That's because the color swatch management is independent of your viewers, right? You have a tone mapping choice here, or a view transform choice here. You have another view transform choice inside of your render view, and these guys are independent of each other, right? You can use these to make creative decisions throughout your day, right? So if you want to have your color swatches also get to that flame sepia, all you have to do is go to your transforms at the color management level and say my default view transform instead of sRGB is flame sepia. So this is going to change the swatch management or the color pot management inside of the shader balls to also use that flame sepia. So now you can see that obviously it's still a 0.5 value with zero saturation, but it's really pushed into that warm range. Pretty straightforward. So one more thing that I want to talk to you about here. Notice that when I render this guy out, that I've got this shadow on the ground plane and it's not showing up in the reflections. I've actually got this light set up as though it was made in an older version of Maya. So prior to Maya 2015, whenever you made a light and you ray trace that light's shadows, its shadow depth limit was set to a value of 1, meaning it wouldn't show up in reflections. It would have to be a value of 2 or higher to show up in reflections. This was changed in 2015, but for those of you working with legacy versions of Maya or maybe old scene files of Maya, there's a good chance that people didn't go through and crank that shadow limit up to the new default value of 3. So just make sure that you keep an eye on that, because obviously as soon as we put that value higher, it has the ability, the reflection has the ability to see that shadow, right? Which is exactly what you want. So you can see that shadow showing up down here now correctly. So the next thing that we want to talk about is what happens when we turn on the sun sky system inside of Maya. So let's blow away these lights inside of here. We'll get rid of this light, and I believe I had an ambient light inside of here also. So if we blow those guys away and we bring up our render options here and we go to our sun sky system and we create that guy, I'm going to crank down the accuracy and put this down to a value of 0.1, and that's going to make my final gather a little bit faster here. When we create that sun sky system, because it was a legacy system, it was actually trying to do its own form of gamma correction and its own form of sort of tone mapping. So taking that high dynamic range image and bringing it down into a range of 0 to 1, a value of 0 to 1. So it was kind of clamping it down and putting this gamma on there. So if we have our color management system turned on in conjunction to the sun sky system, basically what we're going to have is not the right color, right? We're basically getting a double view transform on our viewer here, right? If we turn this guy off, that would be more appropriate, right? But often you're not going to want to do that, right? That's really not the ideal workflow. The ideal workflow is to blow away the old MIP exposure simple, get rid of that guy. We don't need the sun sky system trying to do color management at the camera level, baking that into the image. We want to do that all in post or in our viewer transforms. So now if we render this guy back out, now that we blew that away, the dynamic range is going to be back, so we're going to have to drop the exposure down to get this guy to be in a range that's kind of nice, but obviously we're not getting that double transform happening. And just for purposes of prettiness, we'll get rid of that flame sepia. So just keep that in mind. So the next thing that I want to talk to you about is point lights. So point lights inside of Maya by default aren't set up to behave like lights behave in the real world. Let's go ahead and take a look at that really quickly. So if we create a point light in this example, let's create a simple point light, and we position this point light, sort of over near the tip of our wing here, and we're gonna just do something like just blast. Let me use my V key to position that guy. We're gonna just blast this guy out with like something that's like bright red, and we'll put the value up to like 20, right? So let's go ahead and render this. So we render this guy out. And you can see, because there's no decay on that light, it's really hitting the ground plane a lot. It's totally blasting the tip of the sky. It's not behaving like a light would in the real world. It would drop off much, much quicker. It would drop off with quadratic decay. So let's go ahead and look at the difference between that. So we'll minimize that guy down. You'll notice that I'm not closing the render view. I'm minimizing it. If you close the render view inside of Maya, it'll blow away the exposure setting you have and the tone map setting you have and load the default. So that's why I keep minimizing it and not closing it. It's a simple little tip, but it makes a big difference. So let's put this to quadratic, and we'll just crank that guy up to 2000 because we need a much higher intensity now that it's got that proper decay, and we'll render this guy out. So now you can see that obviously we're still getting really bright red over here on the ship, but notice the ground plane is not getting blown out, and notice the nose of the ship. It's also not getting all that red, so it's behaving correctly. So that's pretty much it. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch the webinar. Most of these tips and trips were taken from my blog that I've been doing for the last year called The Desk. That's on the area. You can also get to all of the stuff that I've worked on the last year on my YouTube channel, which is just Daryl Obert. You just Google that or Google Maya Mondays and it'll come up. Subscribe to that guy. I'm going to continue doing these guys every week, or try to do a new blog post every week. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to check it out. Cheers.